Ahoy there folks, I'm Captain Benzie and welcome to another video for EVE Echoes. And yes, I do mean EVE Echoes, even though once again I am in EVE Online. It's just because ultimately this is another talking point video. This is going to be one of those videos where I have a concept, I want to talk to you all about it, and it does rely a little bit on having some knowledge in EVE Online as well, as you'll understand as we go further into this one. In today's video, I want to talk to you all about the problems with missiles, and this is not sort of a controversial topic. This is very much a thing that you can look at the history of EVE Echoes, and you can see this from start to finish, or start to current position at least, should I say. Ultimately, what I'm going to do in today's video is showcase the problems that we have with missiles and talk about how we have got to the situation that we are in. Then I'm going to look at ways that we can fix it. And again, I'm going to be using EVE Online as an inspiration for this. Do I think EVE Online should be a blueprint for Echoes? No, absolutely not. I love it when EVE Echoes does something completely new and off the wall. I just sometimes think that when there is a problem in EVE Echoes, we can look to EVE Online for inspiration of how to fix it. That's not even to say that EVE Online is the perfect game. It's not. It has its own problems. But in this situation, when we're talking about missiles, well, you'll understand as we go. So just bear with me on this one, please. Of course, you can treat this like a podcast. There's not going to be all that much in the way of visuals. I'll describe what I'm doing as I go, of course. If you do enjoy this video and find it interesting, please let me know. Hit like on the video. Really helps us out by helping to suggest my channel to other EVE Online and EVE Echoes players. And do subscribe to the channel, dinging that notification bell if you haven't already. Finally, if you want to go the extra mile to help support this channel, I have a Redbubble merchandise store and a Patreon page that you can pledge to support out that has some exclusive merchandise and the ability to get your name in the credits at the end of the video, and some other stuff hopefully coming soon. Anyway, with all of that said and done then, let's talk about the problem with missiles. First things first then, we need to discuss how missile mechanics actually work, just to give you a vague understanding of what all the stats mean. Hopefully you are familiar with the most of this, but here is a sort of infographic I put together for the Catskill Academy. Here you can see missile statistics explained. Ultimately, we've got on the left side here a Mark I small missile launcher with all of its stats available and an explanation of what this all means. So flight velocity and flight time gives you your total range. That shouldn't at all be like anything controversial there, although admittedly we do just have this as a flat stat in Echoes, 15 kilometers there. Explosion velocity then is the minimum speed at which a target would need to move to negate some of the missile's damage. Think of this as like outrunning the explosion, which I've shown here on the right hand side. You can see here that on this Mark I small missile launcher, the explosion velocity is 170 meters per second, so basically anything going faster than 170 meters per second is going to take reduced damage from this missile. Then we also have explosion radius as our second application stat. Explosion radius is described as how small a ship needs to be only be hit by part of the explosion it's flying through. A smaller explosion radius helps focus a missile's damage to deal more damage to smaller targets. Basically, small ship, big explosion, reduced damage. So a small explosion here, like the 40 meters explosion radius, if this hits a ship whose signature radius is 40 meters or higher, then the small missile launcher here will apply 100% of its explosion radius damage. That will be 100% application in regards to the math that we're going to see in a moment. So let's actually have a look at that, because this is where things get a little bit crazy. I've talked about this in the stealth bomber video, but this is the actual bit of maths that calculates missile damage. First of all, what we're looking at here is the total damage applied to the target is the damage profile of the missile. In the case of, like, say it does 200, 200, 200, 200, that's going to be a total of 800. Then it is the minimum of these various different calculations. There are 3 calculations performed for missile application, and then ultimately it is the minimum of those 3 multiplied by the damage. So the first obviously is 1, because we can never have, if something is larger than 1, it's going to be doing more than 100% damage. So if 1 is the smallest amount, it means we're going to do 100% application, right? That should make sense there. Then we have the second part, which is signature radius of the target over the explosion radius of the missile. So if you take the signature radius of the target, say it's 50 meters, and you divide that by the explosion radius, which in this case of the small missile was 40 meters, you can see that's going to be larger than 1. Therefore, in between those two, it will just go for the 1 to give you the 100% application. But if, for example, it was a 400 meter signature radius against a target with a signature radius of 100, then that's going to be 0.25, right? Which is less than 1. So then it would be damage times by 0.25 would be the application profile that we use. But then we've got this bit here, which looks very, very confusing, but essentially what we're looking at there is comparing the signature radius and the explosion radius, along with the explosion velocity and the target's velocity. So by doing the math there, signature radius plus the explosion velocity, multiplied by explosion velocity over explosion radius and times by target's velocity, and then this little thing called DRF, which is the damage reduction factor. This is just a static number that depends on the particular type of missile. We don't worry too much about this. If you want to do the raw calculations for things, you will need to know what the DRF of your particular missile is, but the basic point I'm getting at here is you've got these 3 different parts of missile application. Which is smaller? Is it 1 that's the smallest number? Is it signature radius divided by explosion radius? Or is it signature radius times by explosion velocity divided by explosion radius over target velocity? And ultimately, whichever one of those 3 is the smaller amount, then the more that's the one that you choose. So if this was 1, if this was 0.25, and this was 0.1, then the 0.1 is what is going to be actually applied to the target. So you have the damage times by whichever of those 3 values is smaller. What this ultimately means is that when you look at something, so if I jump back to that missile statistics here, when you look at these two here, the target's velocity or the target's signature radius are what matter most. Unlike turrets, which it's angular velocity and complex things like that, it is absolute velocity that affects a missile. If a target is moving directly away from you, directly towards you, or completely parallel to you, or even perpendicular to you, it does not matter with missiles. All missiles care about is the target's signature radius and the absolute velocity that they are moving at. Now, this means missiles will always apply better to a larger and slower target. Small missiles have larger explosion velocities and small explosion radiuses. This means they apply their damage pretty much 100% of the time against anything that is bigger than a frigate. If you're using Mark 1 small missile launchers, as long as the target's under 170 meters per second and bigger than 40 meters, you're doing 100% of your damage, and there are a lot of ships in Echoes that fit that criteria. Ultimately, the same is not true once you get to larger missiles. Larger missiles, of course, have much bigger damage numbers, but they've also got a lower explosion velocity and a higher explosion radius. Now, this means that there are fewer ships that those can apply 100% to, and that is how missiles are balanced. Essentially, small missiles apply really, really well, but they do very little damage, whereas the large missiles have massive damage, but they don't apply well at all. So where does this become a problem? Well, let's jump back into EVE Online for this bit. Now, essentially, when the developers created Echoes, they took most of the code and statistics from EVE Online and just brought it straight across into EVE Echoes. Of course they did, that makes sense. We're looking to sort of make a very similar game. You may as well import the math from things. The problem with this arises in that because of the tech level system, oh, there we go again, once again it's our old friend causing problems for us. Because of the tech level system, when you compare the Bellicose to the Bellicose in EVE Online, the Bellicose in Echoes to the Bellicose in EVE Online, they're very similar in stats. But then you've got the Bellicose Covert Ops, and then the Covert Ops 2, and then the Covert Ops 3, which because of the tech system requiring those to be more powerful, they have to be better, which means most of our ships in the game are moving faster and have a smaller signature radius than in EVE Online. Now, hopefully you've already spotted the problem here, that if we've taken the missile statistics from EVE Online and brought them across, but then we've made all of our ships faster and smaller, then missiles are innately going to just not apply their damage as well as they should. Which means when you've got those statistics, you're looking at EVE Online missiles and EVE Echoes missiles having the same stats. But when you actually launch them, the ones in EVE Echoes don't do as much because the targets are smaller and faster, and therefore the application is worse, right? So already we have a problem starting. Now the second problem, and the reason I wanted to have EVE Online open, is because of missile skills. Now again, I know that a lot of people look at EVE Online skills and go, my goodness, that really is absolutely insane when you compare it to EVE Echoes. And it's true. In EVE Echoes we have small missile operation and small missile upgrade. That's all you need if you want to be using small missiles. If you want to use medium missiles, you use medium missile operation and medium missile upgrade, and then large missiles, large missile upgrade, capital missile operation, capital missile upgrade, right? Well, you do still have stuff like that here, like we've got rocket specialization rockets, heavy missiles, light missiles, this kind of thing. Those are basically the small and medium and large missiles. Here, for example, light missiles, skill with manually targeted missiles, 5% bonus to light missile damage per skill level. That's small missiles, right? Then we also have rockets over here, skill with small short-range missiles, 5% bonus to rocket damage per skill level. These are what we call small torpedoes and small missiles. So you can see that there are two separate skills for those, but we don't have, whereas in Echoes we have small operation and small upgrade, here we have small missiles and small torpedoes, basically, as skills. But all those do is increase the damage. Then we have a look at things like, for example, rapid launch. Rapid launch gives a 3% bonus to missile launcher rate of fire per level, and you'll notice that does not account for light missiles or rockets, or it is all forms of missiles. So whether you're going to be using light missiles, or whether you're going to be using cruise missiles, whether you're using torpedoes or rockets, whatever you're going to be using, that rapid launch means that it launches 3% faster per level trained. We then have things. Missile launcher operation is of course the basic one here, 2% bonus to missile launcher rate of fire per skill level. That applies to all of them as well. Missile projection, here we have a 10% bonus to all missiles maximum velocity per level, so that gives them extra range. Warhead upgrades, proficiency at upgrading missile warheads with deadlier payloads, 2% bonus to all missile damage. You can kind of see where we're going here. Guided missile precision, this gives a 5% decrease in per level in factor of signature radius. So guided missile precision is what is reducing the explosion radius of our missiles. That's helping things apply. Now you'll notice that if you open up any of the skills in EVE Echoes, any of the missile skills in EVE Echoes, whether that's small, medium, large or capital, whether it's operations or upgrade, none of them affect explosion velocity. You do get a reduction to, so you get an increase to damage, you get an increase to range, and you do get a reduction to explosion radius, which helps with application. But here we also have, now I've got to find which one it is, target navigation prediction, I think. There we are, 10% decrease per level in factor of target's velocity. This is a skill that automatically reduces the increases the explosion velocity of your missiles. It helps them apply their damage to the target better. We don't have this in Echoes. So what we have in Echoes is a situation where missile statistics have been brought across piecemeal from EVE Online, but then expected to apply against smaller and faster moving ships, and we also don't have the bonuses to explosion velocity that we get in EVE Online as well. So the ships are smaller and faster, which means our application is going to be worse, and we can't buff up our explosion velocity either, which means that it's going to be even worse in regards to application. You can see here that if you train target navigation prediction right the way up to level 5, that is a 50% increase to your explosion radius. That's huge. That is a big, big bonus that we just simply do not have in Echoes. This means that missiles are just inherently bad. I'm not going to say they're terrible, I'm not going to say they're useless, but what NetEase has essentially done since the game launched is look at missiles and gone, these do too much, we're going to nerf their range, which is where the Caracal meta disappeared originally. Then they've gone, oh, they don't do enough damage. So instead of playing with the application formula, what they've done instead is just increase the damage on missiles. So now, missiles in EVE Echoes do mad amounts of damage, they can just never actually apply to their target. And that's a problem, right? Because the second you start actually getting application to a good point in the future, well, we're going to hit a situation where suddenly missiles need massive nerfs because they are massively overtanked on their damage because netties couldn't be bothered to figure out how to actually fix the application. All they saw was that missiles launch and don't do the damage. So we're just going to make the damage number bigger, and therefore when they do only 1% of their damage, they're doing 1% of a massive number rather than 1% of a sane number. This is why we get people come onto the Eve Echoes community Discord and complain that the Raven Striker is actually not as good as it should be, despite the fact that it has absolutely mad actual DPS, paper DPS when you fit it. And it's because the application is absolutely awful. Now, the April balance update was intended to fix this, because literally what I've just said, if we jump back to our missile statistics here, we're in a situation where we have the standard explosion velocity and explosion radius, but everything moves faster and is smaller. So when NetEase turned around and said, actually, we want to slow down every ship, we want the ship command bonuses, so like industrial ship command, frigate command, all this kind of thing, we want those to, instead of giving you 45% additional flight velocity, they're actually only going to give you 20% additional flight velocity. This was a genuinely genius move, because it meant that missiles were suddenly really good. And yes, I will continue to sort of wax on about this one, but essentially when we tested this in the server, the fact that everything had slowed down really helped missiles. Yes, missiles probably were still doing a bit too much damage and would need some reduction to their actual damage profile, but the application was good. When you looked at the actual number that you had as paper DPS and the actual damage you were doing, they were actually similar. You could see the effect there. Whereas people complained because they didn't like the fact that their ships were slowing down. When we tested this, ultimately the ships were still moving fast enough. If you were in a ship that's supposed to speed tank, it still speed tanked. And ultimately, even if there were issues there, we can just tweak tracking on turrets to help with that. Ultimately, that was a huge fix to missiles that just didn't make it through. That reduction from 45% down to 40% from the command skills just isn't enough. We can see the explosion radius is actually okay on missiles for the most part. Like I showed in my video with the stealth bombers, you can easily increase a target signature radius by using things like target painters. And a couple of stacked target painters will easily take a target over the signature radius required to get the 100% application here. And remember, with the missile formula, if that becomes 100% or higher, then ultimately we just go to 100%, so we're okay there. It's much harder to get a target's velocity below your explosion velocity. You can see that is going to be the problem in this. That whole explosion velocity and target velocity calculation is always going to be the problem in Eve Echoes in regards to how its damage works. And that's because here, look at small missiles. Basic small missiles have 170 meters per second explosion velocity. Point to me a ship that goes slower than 170 meters per second. That means a Mark I small missile launcher, a small missile launcher, is never going to 100% apply its damage, even to a battleship, because a battleship is going to be going faster than that 170 meters per second, right? Does that make sense? So you can see that the problem with Eve Echoes and missiles comes down to speed. And ultimately, by reducing every ship's speed, you help the missile application. Now, the other thing that we do absolutely need, 100%, is to get these support skills. Now, I'm hoping we get these support skills. I think we need an actual skill. I did an entire video on this, where we need skills like a missile skill to go alongside the drone skill. The drone skill, it makes drones expensive in skill points because you've got to train 3 skills. You don't just train small weapon operation and small weapon upgrade, you have to train the drone skill as well, or medium or large, depending on whichever one you're going for. Whereas with missiles, we could have another one that ultimately adds a bit of range and adds the explosion velocity onto it as well, something that helps with the damage application there. It's one of those skills that not every missile pilot will need, because if you're using small missiles, well, you can probably get away without it, but even then it's still going to be useful, as I've just shown. We need these skills, or in an absolute worst scenario, we need to get explosion velocity increase as a stat on the missile skills. On small missile operation, small missile upgrade, we need explosion velocity to be one of the factors that actually affects. It needs to increase the explosion velocity so we can actually apply our damage. Now this brings me to another point as well, which is again a little bit of a controversial point. I'm going to open up the ship tree here just to have some nice imagery in the background on this. Now this comes down to the fact that NetEase have recently announced that they're going to be adding a Caldari exclusive Missile Attack Battlecruiser. Now Missile Attack Battlecruiser is obviously something that just doesn't exist in the game, and this first of all brings me to one particular complaint regarding certain parts of the community. Missile Attack Battlecruisers are the ones that, like the Typhoon, like the Naga, the Talos, and the Oracle. These are the ones that use oversized turrets, so large lasers, large railguns, and large cannons. Ultimately, you'll notice that for the Caldari, their attack battlecruiser is the Naga, and in Eve Echoes, of course, the Naga still uses railguns, just like the Talos uses railguns. And this has led some people to complain that why don't I get an attack battlecruiser for my preferred weapon system, which, in the case that was being argued, is missiles. Now, there is a reason for this, genuinely. I think first of all though, what I want to tackle here is just that concept of basically FOMO. Ultimately, people are complaining people were complaining before this, that it's unfair that there's a large cannon, a large railgun, and a large laser attack battlecruiser, but there isn't one for large missiles. That's unfair. And it's not about whether or not it's fair, it's about what this actually brings to the game. It's about the balance aspect of things. And I'm just going to quickly scroll over here and click on something to point out that large missile users get something that standard, like the cannons and the railguns and the lasers don't get. This is a Manticore. It's a stealth bomber. Stealth bombers are frigates that have bonuses to large missiles. Like, genuinely, if you're complaining that, oh, we don't get this down here, well, then you could make the counter-argument that, well, yeah, maybe we need stealth bombers, in inverted commas, that use large lasers, large cannons, and large railguns, and at that point, things just start getting ridiculous. And I know there's going to be someone in the comment section who comes at me and says, well, yeah, why don't we have those? And my answer is just no. Just no, come on. Can we be serious for a moment? There is no need for a frigate that uses large railguns. That is just not a necessity that we have. Would it be interesting? Yes. Does it add anything to the game? No. Would it be dumb? Hell yes it would. Now, I actually spoke recently to CCP Swift, who is one of the EVE Online developers, one of their balance devs, because I was doing some research into this about why on earth actually is the Naga using railguns, because clearly we've got two railgun battlecruisers, attack battlecruisers. We could have had the Naga using missiles. That could have been a thing. And it turns out that when these were actually being added to the game, the Naga was a missile attack battlecruiser. The problem with this is, and the reason it got changed, is because an attack battlecruiser that uses large missiles is just dumb in every shape and form. Attack battlecruisers are supposed to be hit-and-run, fast-moving vessels that have very little tank. They are fragile glass cannons. Now that works when it comes to large turrets, because of how large turrets work. In that if something is at range and approaching towards you, then you get much better application. Those turrets are going to actually be able to hit various different targets. You can use large cannons on a tornado and still hit something like an approaching frigate. As long as that frigate's coming in at very low angular velocity, they can still do that. With missiles, however, that doesn't work because of what we've just talked about. If you put large missiles onto a battlecruiser, it still has large missile application, right? And we've just shown how large missile application in Echoes is already absolute garbage. Now this means that you're either spending development resources making a battlecruiser that is going to just be garbage because people already don't like the Raven and things because its application just doesn't work. It can't hit anything smaller than a battleship without massively sacrificing DPS. You'll see that everyone who runs a Raven pretty much tends to go for large rapids. And what are large rapids? They're fast-firing medium missiles. because the application of large weapons, the large missiles and large torpedoes, is just utter garbage. So what would people put on this theoretical Caldari attack battlecruiser using large missiles? They're going to use large rapids, aren't they? Because they're trying to get around the fact that large missiles have atrocious application. Now this means that you've got an attack battlecruiser using using large rapids, which are the same as medium missiles but faster firing, compared to people flying a Drake. Now the Drake is medium missiles. You don't oversize here. At best you go for medium missiles or medium torpedoes, and if you're going for medium missiles on a Drake and then comparing that to an attack battlecruiser using large rapids, they have the same application, but the large rapids have better damage. Do you see the problem here? How that immediately just negates the Drake's existence? To the point that if we compare, say, the Tornado and the Hurricane, or the Oracle and the Harbinger, they don't just outclass each other like that. There are reasons that you would use a Hurricane rather than a Tornado. There are reasons that you would use an Oracle instead of a Harbinger, and vice versa. There's no reason you would ever use a Drake if you can have an attack battlecruiser that basically has the same stats, but with better, with more damage. The same application, but more damage. Now the alternative is that, oh, okay, but what if NetEase promoted it to be using large missiles? Well, and not rapids. Well, then you're gonna get like with the stealth bombers, for example, how those are literally specified to large torpedoes. Well, you sit there in a situation where you're now using a weapon that just has terrible application. You've got an attack battlecruiser that no one's going to use because essentially it has the exact same damage and application as a battleship, but none of the tank whatsoever. It has no use in the game. Like, why would you not fly a Typhoon 2, which is going to be arguably faster and better tanking and gets better application? So the situation there now is that the Caldari attack battlecruiser is a waste of resources. So far we've got a couple of scenarios here that are all wasted resources. What happens if you make the attack battlecruiser have application bonuses? Well, you get that same situation as we saw with the Drake earlier. If it has application bonuses, it now just is better than the Raven because it's smaller and faster than the Raven, but the same damage with better application, or it just outclasses the Drake because, again, it can now use large missiles and get the same application as the Drake with medium missiles, or whatever. You can see where I'm going with this. When I spoke to CCP Swift about this, he basically said that when it came down to the Naga using missiles on the test server when they were first coming up with the attack battlecruisers, it just didn't work. It just couldn't be tuned. It was ridiculously powerful, or it was ridiculously useless, because that's how missiles work. Missiles as a weapon system work differently to turrets. Ultimately, turrets get a pass on how an approaching or moving directly away or stationary target, a target with low angular velocity, can still be hit by large turrets. That's the same is not true for large missiles. So you can sit there and say it's like, the same discussion as like the Raven Striker compared to the Apocalypse Striker, that the Raven Striker's siege mode is absolutely useless. It's not. It's just that that's the wrong way to look at it. The siege mode is actually very good on the Raven Striker if you're using the Raven Striker's siege mode for a siege. If you're using the Apocalypse Striker's siege mode for a siege, I would argue that the Raven Striker is actually better at a siege. The difference here isn't that the Raven Striker siege mode isn't good enough, it's that turrets work very differently than missiles do. Which means that the Apocalypse Striker can get away with it in PvE because it has the range to force enemy rats to go to 0 angular velocity. You can't do that with missiles because the angular velocity doesn't matter. It's the absolute velocity and the signature radius that matter, and there's no real way to modify both of those things from extreme range. Yes, you can web something and thus reduce its velocity to ridiculously slow, and then hopefully your explosion velocity is actually capable of hitting the target, but that requires them to get within 15 kilometers, or for you to have friends that just web something into non-moving. So hopefully this is kind of clearing the point here. I've had a lot of people complain that I'm just, moaning about the Caldari attack battlecruiser, like, oh, you just don't want people to have fun. Really? The guy who wants to promote Eve Echoes as much as possible doesn't want people to have fun in the game? No, I just want the developers to spend time and resources on things that are actually useful and beneficial. And when I say actually useful and beneficial, I'm not just saying please don't waste resources on a ship that is either just going to simply make every other missile ship around it obsolete, or if it's not done like perfectly, it's either going to make every other missile ship obsolete, or it's going to be useless, at which point, why did you add it to the game? What problem was this solving? And that comes down to my big philosophy in regards to game design and balance. Once you have a core game operational and you're looking to add more stuff or you're looking to balance things, the core tenet for me is, what does this add to the game? What does this bring to the game? What advantages does this give? What new gameplay does this give players? Or what problem currently existing in the game does this fix? And that is kind of the point to me, that a large attack battlecruiser doesn't do any of those things. It doesn't add anything new. If it is good, then it ultimately takes away a lot of other options. Why on earth would you ever fly a Cyclone or a Drake when you could fly this mythical attack battlecruiser with large missiles? Why would you fly the Raven or the Typhoon when you can fly this large attack battlecruiser that does the same thing but better? Or it's useless, at which point nobody flies it either in either situation. So on one hand, yes, technically it adds something new, but it takes away other options instead. On the other hand, it doesn't add anything new at all. What problem is it fixing? None. There is no problem that actually fixes in regards to missiles. If you want your missiles to be better, I've just talked about it. I've just shown you how to fix missiles. We need support skills in Eve Echoes that especially give explosion velocity bonuses. And if we could go back to actually having everything slow down, because it broke nothing. Nothing broke on the test server. When they slowed everything the hell down, interceptors still worked, faction frigates still speed tanked, cruisers like the Stabber Fleet issue still took massively reduced damage, I could still speed tank with my Bellicose 2 covert ops, all of these things still worked fine. It broke nothing. Just people complained, mostly people who weren't on the test server, because they didn't like the concept of their numbers going down. They didn't understand why this change was being put into place. They didn't like that it theoretically affected them, and just couldn't accept that it didn't affect them. And so we had massive complaints, and NetEase rolled it back. I am hoping that in a future balance patch, maybe the October one later this year, we see that speed reduction come into effect again. It is absolutely crazy. I talk about like strip mining and that recently, and how ridiculously fast that is. The same is true with our ships. The same is true with like our frigates and cruisers. They just move so much faster than they ever needed to, and that causes all kinds of problems down the line. It means that we have massive sort of need for webifying and things like that, which just doesn't exist elsewhere. And I don't know. It's just, these are my thoughts and opinions, you know? I'm sitting here and I'm looking at this new Caldari Attack Battlecruiser. I've got the Drake on screen here. Obviously this isn't going to be a Drake, it should be a new Attack Battlecruiser. But I look at it, and just no matter which way you break it down, I want this to be exciting, I want this to be good. But as CCP Swift himself said, we couldn't get it to balance. CCP, the people who designed the entire underlying core functionality of this game, could not get a missile attack battlecruiser to work. They basically said it was just too good, or it was useless. It didn't work either way, because in a meta that favoured speed, it was just broken, overpowered. And what does our meta currently favour? Speed. Anyway, folks, that is everything for today's lengthy diatribe into everything wrong with missiles, and hopefully some ways that we can fix these coming in the future. I would love to see missile support skills added to actually make missiles a better weapon system than they currently are. The Caldari Attack Battlecruiser, I do hope that NetEase quietly cancels that and just goes, you know what, maybe this isn't such a good idea, because you know what, it isn't such a good idea. There is no need for it, other than people who just want it because they don't have it. They're looking at the various turrets and going, why do they get a large weapon system battlecruiser and we don't as missiles? Well, hopefully I've explained in this video why missiles don't get that and why they don't need it. And ultimately, if you want an undersized ship that uses large missiles, let's fix the stealth bombers. And on that note, why not go watch that video if you haven't already? Anyway, folks, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching this lengthy diatribe right the way through to the end. Happy sailing, and see you in New Eden.